Summary of Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. Henry Dashwood stayed at his uncle's house, Norland Park, in Sussex, England. He had one son from a previous marriage and 3 girls with his current wife. The inheritance of Norland was passed down to Henry's son John and John's own son after the death of his uncle. It didn't leave Henry's 3 girls with much money, so he asked John to take care of them when he died. John then wants to give each of his sisters £3,000, but his wife Fanny quickly tells him not to so that the money can go to their own son. After Henry dies, his widow, Mrs. Dashwood, and her 3 daughters, the sensible and self-controlled Eleanor, the sensitive Marianne, and the young Margaret, stay at Norland for a few months. Mrs. Dashwood hates Fanny, but Eleanor becomes close with Edward Ferrars, Fanny's brother. Maria and Mrs. Dashwood believe that he will marry Eleanor. The writer, Sir John Middleton, is related to Mrs. Dashwood and writes to give her a place to live on his land, Barton Park. Mrs. Dashwood takes Sir John up on his offer and moves her girls into a house on his land. A lot of the time, the Dashwoods have meals and balls at the home of Sir John and Lady Middleton. They also meet Mrs. Jennings, Lady Middleton's mother, who is nice but likes to talk about other people. She likes to predict and support new relationships. Colonel Brandon, a friend of Sir John's and a single 35-year-old, also stays at the Middletons' house a lot. As soon as they meet, Brandon falls in love with Marianne. But Marianne doesn't see any reason to marry someone so old and tasteless as Brandon. The Dashwood girls go for a walk in the country one day. They quickly run back to their house when it starts to rain, but Marianne trips and falls. A gentleman who was walking by picked her up and carried her home with honor. He says his name is Willoughby. Not long after that, Willoughby shows up again at dinner at Barton Park with the Dashwoods. Sir John says that Willoughby is very well worth catching, and Marianne starts to like him. Willoughby goes to the Dashwood house a lot and spends a lot of time with Marianne. A lot of the time, they agree with each other about art, music, and books. It looks like they might get engaged, according to Mrs. Dashwood. Marianne and Willoughby get closer as the Dashwoods keep going to more and more social events at Barton Park. Margaret thinks Marianne and Willoughby are engaged when she sees Marianne give Willoughby a lock of her hair. At Barton Park one evening, Mrs. Jennings asks Eleanor if she has a boyfriend. Margaret reveals that Eleanor likes a guy whose name starts with F. A big group meets at Barton Park the next day to go on an adventure to Colonel Brandon's brother-in-law's land. But Brandon gets a letter and has to leave for London right away, so the trip doesn't happen as planned. Everyone plans to spend the day driving around the country. Willoughby and Marianne take one carriage to Allenham, his aunt's property, which he is likely to receive, and look it over together. Willoughby keeps acting like he loves Marianne for a few more days. But one day, Mrs. Dashwood, Eleanor, and Margaret came back from Barton Park to find Willoughby's carriage outside their house. Maria is crying and very upset when they get inside. Willoughby tells them that he has to go to London for work reasons and can't come back. Eleanor has some doubts about Willoughby because no one is sure if he and Marianne are really engaged. Marianne feels unbearably sad after Willoughby leaves. The 2 of them go for a walk one day. They see a man coming up behind them, and Marianne is sure it's Willoughby. In the end, they see that it is Edward Ferrars when the man gets closer. But it's strange that Edward doesn't seem happy and at ease when he sees Eleanor. Marianne sees that he has a ring on his hand that has a hair in it. Edward says it's Fanny's hair, but Eleanor and Marianne both think it looks like Eleanor's. For some reason, Eleanor thinks he got it from her in secret. After about a week, Edward goes without asking her to marry him. Soon after, the Middletons invite Charlotte Palmer, Lady Middleton's sister, to Barton Park and meet her and her husband. The Palmers know Willoughby and think that Marianne and he are engaged, but Eleanor isn't so sure. The Middletons have more guests after the Palmers leave. They are Anne and Lucy Steele, 2 young girls who are related to Mrs. Jennings. Eleanor and Marianne don't like the Steele sisters very much because they only talk about potential boyfriends and new loves. Sir John says that Eleanor is in love with Edward Ferrars and says that they know Edward well, but Lucy corrects her and says that they don't really know him that well. Lucy asks Eleanor if she knows Mrs. Ferrars, Edward's mother, one day as they walk outside. She tells him that she has been engaged to Edward in secret for 4 years. They thought that Lucy's mother, Mrs. Ferrars, would not like the marriage because Lucy doesn't have much money. Eleanor sees a letter from Edward, and Lucy tells her that she gave him a lock of hair, which he keeps in a ring. Liz is shocked, but she knows Lucy's story is true. She questions whether Edward lied to her on purpose when he tried to win her love. After a party at Barton Park not long after this, Eleanor asks Lucy more about her proposal. Lucy tells Edward that she loves him, but they probably won't be able to get married until Mrs. Ferrars dies. If Eleanor and Marianne want to stay with Mrs. Jennings in London in January, they are welcome. She knows Edward will be in London in February, so Eleanor doesn't want to go. But Marianne really wants to go so she can maybe see Willoughby. Margaret and their mother stay at Barton with their sisters while the sisters go to London for a while. She writes to Willoughby as soon as they get to London, but she doesn't hear back from him. Colonel Brandon often goes to see the Dashwood sisters instead. Marianne is worried because she hasn't heard from Willoughby and can't enjoy the city events they go to with him. Eleanor writes to her mom and begs her to please ask Marianne directly if she is engaged to Willoughby or not. Finally, Willoughby is at the party that Eleanor, Marianne, and Lady Middleton go to. Willoughby doesn't like Marianne and doesn't pay much attention to her. Marianne has to leave the party right away because she is sad. The next morning, Marianne gets a letter from Willoughby. When she reads it, she feels almost choked by grief. In the letter, Willoughby denies having feelings for her and tells her that he is engaged to someone else. Wilbur's quick change in behavior shocks both Eleanor and Marianne, and Eleanor tries to comfort her sister. She tells Marianne to control her feelings, but Marianne says she can't act like everything is fine when she's really upset. It gets out that Willoughby is going to marry the rich Miss Grey. She finds out that Marianne and Willoughby were never officially engaged and that Willoughby only told her he loved her. Mrs. Jennings tries to make Marianne feel better by telling her she will now marry Colonel Brandon. The bad news was shared with Willoughby, so Colonel Brandon goes to see Eleanor one day and tells her something that he thinks will help Marianne. He has to tell Marianne about a woman named Eliza that he used to love in order to explain. Eliza was truly in love with Brandon, but she was forced to marry his brother. Evan and Eliza tried to run away, but they were caught. After that, Brandon left the country to join the military. While he was gone, Eliza was tempted by many men and ended up divorcing Brandon's brother. When Colonel Brandon got back to the country, he found her locked up in a house because she was in debt and dying of consumption. He promised to take care of her daughter Eliza, who wasn't her real child. As a child, Colonel Brandon took care of this daughter. But she was last seen after a trip to Bath with friends last year. There was a message for Brandon while he was at Barton Park telling him that Eliza had been sex with Willoughby, gotten pregnant, and then left her. This was the reason Brandon had left Barton so quickly. She is shocked to learn this about Willoughby, but she appreciates Brandon being honest. Marianne doesn't feel better after hearing the news. She used to think Willoughby was a good man, but now she's sad about the loss of Willoughby's character. In the meantime, Colonel Brandon and Eleanor talk a lot, and Eleanor starts to value him as a friend. Mrs. Jennings comes to the conclusion that Colonel Brandon will soon ask Eleanor to marry him. Marianne finally agrees to leave the house with Eleanor. They go to a jeweler with Mrs. Jennings and meet a rude guy who is ordering a toothpick case. Eleanor runs into her brother John, who has just moved into town, at the shop. He meets Mrs. Jennings, Colonel Brandon, and the Middletons when he goes to see Eleanor and Marianne the next day. He tells Eleanor that he is sure Brandon likes her and makes her feel good. Besides that, he says that Mrs. Ferrars set up Edward's marriage to Miss Morton, a rich woman. Once John and Fanny get to know the Middletons, the Steeles, and Mrs. Jennings, they ask all of them to dinner, along with Mrs. Ferrars and the Dashwood sisters. Eleanor is excited to finally meet Mrs. Ferrars, and Lucy is especially excited to meet the woman who might become her mother-in-law. At the dinner, Mrs. Ferrars is rude to Eleanor, who she clearly didn't like, but she seems to really like Lucy, which makes Lucy very happy. Soon after, Eleanor and Marianne go to a party with Fanny and John. Eleanor sees the guy from the jewelry shop and learns that he is Robert Ferrars, Edward's brother. After about 2 weeks, Mrs. Jennings tells Eleanor that her secret engagement to Edward has been found out. Lucy was living with the Steele sisters when Fanny found out about it and lost it. She threw Lucy out of her house. The next day, John goes to see them and tells them that Mrs. Ferrars basically kicked Edward out of the family when she found out about his secret engagement. Even so, Edward wouldn't back out of the marriage. After a few days, Eleanor meets Lucy's sister Aunt in Kensington Gardens. Since Edward no longer has a lot of money, and says that he gave Lucy the chance to leave him, but she refused, so they were going to get married. The next morning, Lucy sends Eleanor a letter saying that she and Edward are still happy together despite everything and that he is going to become a priest. Lucy also says that they will get married once they have a place to live. Marianne and Eleanor finally decide to go back to Barton Cottage after being in London for more than 2 months. On the way, they will stop by Cleveland to see the Palmer family. Colonel Brandon pays them a visit before they leave. Mrs. Jennings heard part of the talk and thinks that Brandon is asking Eleanor to marry him. He is really telling her that he is going to take Edward in and pay him to work on his farm, Delaford. This means that Edward and Lucy can get married, which makes Eleanor very upset, which she hid from Brandon. Edward comes in soon after Brandon leaves, and Eleanor tells him the news. He's very thankful and is going to thank Brandon. When Mrs. Jennings comes back, she finally understands that Brandon did not ask Eleanor to marry him. Eleanor meets John and Fanny before she leaves London. It is there that she hears Robert Ferrars is going to marry Miss Morton instead of Edward. Robert now has all of Edward's fortune that was supposed to go to him. Maria and gets a bad cold at the Palmer family home in Cleveland. Colonel Brandon is sent to Barton to get Mrs. Dashwood because she is so sick that Mrs. Jennings thinks she is going to die. Marianne is finally getting better. The sound of a carriage outside wakes Eleanor up from her nap. It was Willoughby, though, not Barton. He keeps trying to talk to Eleanor even though she tells him to leave. He begs to be able to explain what he did. He says that when he met the Dashwoods for the first time, he wasn't looking for a wife and just wanted to spend time with Marianne. It was his fault that she was happy, and he had no plans to return her affection. But he fell in love with her anyway. He thought his Aunt Mrs. Smith would leave him some money, but when she found out about his affair with Eliza, she took it away from him. At this point, Willoughby was really looking for money, so getting married to Marianne was out of the question. He married Miss Grey for her money, not because he loved her. And it hurt him to avoid Marianne in London. When she sent him letters, Miss Grey got suspicious and read them. She was mad, so she told Willoughby to write her a letter and send it back. It turns out that Miss Grey wrote the mean letter that Willoughby sent to Marianne. Willoughby admits he was wrong and apologizes very much. Eleanor mostly forgets about Willoughby's mistakes and feels sorry for him. After he goes, Mrs. Dashwood and Colonel Brandon show up soon after. Eleanor is thrilled to hear that Mrs. Dashwood was told by Brandon on the way to Cleveland that he loves Marianne and that she agrees with their decision to get married. When Marianne is fully better, the Dashwoods go back to Barton Cottage. Marianne takes Eleanor for a long walk outside and tells her that her illness has made her think about her life and how she should have treated Willoughby better and how she treated Mrs. Jennings, Fanny, John, the Steeles, and the Middletons better. She makes up her mind to spend the rest of her life with her family and control her feelings. Her only dream is that she could know that Willoughby wasn't always lying to her because she says she is over him. Eleanor uses this time to tell her what Willoughby just told her. Marianne takes the news pretty well and tells Eleanor to tell their mother. Soon after, a helper tells Eleanor that Lucy and Mr. Ferrars are now married. This news makes both Eleanor and Marianne very sad. Colonel Brandon will be coming to visit soon, and Eleanor can't wait. Edward shows up just as she is getting ready for him, though. He tells her that his brother Robert is married to Lucy, not him. She tears up with happiness. Edward says that he got engaged to Lucy when he was too young and didn't have anything to do. They weren't in love with each other, and she left him for his richer brother. Now he asks Eleanor to marry him, and she says yes, much to the happiness of her sisters and mother. In the end, Mrs. Ferrars forgives Edward, gives him back some of his fortune, and reluctantly lets him marry Eleanor. When Eleanor and Edward move to Delaford, her sisters and mother often come to visit. Eleanor, Edward, and Mrs. Dashwood all want Marianne to marry Colonel Brandon, and she does like him more and more over time. She gives up being so set in her ways about love and lets herself learn to love Brandon. After the girls get married, Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters stay close and have a strong family affection. Eleanor and Marianne are happy in their marriages and are also close to each other.
About the author. Jane Austen was born on December 16, 1775, in Steventon, Hampshire. Even though her parents were English gentry, they were still not very wealthy. Jane Austen was too humble to believe how great her writing was, but she did write some of the most famous books in English history, such as Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Emma, and Persuasion. Her books were released without her name on them until after she died, when it was revealed that she was the author. In Austen's time, it wasn't unheard of for women to write under their own names, but it wasn't common either. Although her books are about the complicated routines of courtship and marriage in the British middle class, Austen never got married.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.